An unprecedented number of children from Guatemala, El Salvador and Honduras are migrating to the US. It's a harrowing, dangerous journey. But what happens to them once they arrive in the United States? And what about the undocumented migrants who've lived in the US their entire lives? How are they faring after the implementation of President Obama's Deferred Action program? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. They risk being kidnapped and forced to work for criminal cartels or being killed. But violence and poverty in their countries of birth still force thousands of children to risk their lives to come to the US every year. And as the situation in Central America deteriorates, thanks in large part to the ongoing US-led drug war, more and more have been trying to cross the border. Those who do manage to get into the US are met then with other challenges, from overcrowded emergency shelters to having to navigate the legal system often completely alone. These children do not qualify for President Obama's Deferred Action Memorandum. That program allows US immigration officials to practice prosecutorial discretion in deferring deportation proceedings for undocumented migrants who grew up in the US. We'll have more on how well that initiative is working later on in the show. But first, we bring you Cesar's story, a young Guatemalan who made his way to the US in 2011 when he was 17. On the advice of his attorney, Cesar has asked us not to identify him further. He described his journey.
I like living here a lot, and I'm so happy to be here with my brother. I came here on September 2nd of 2011. Some people murdered my father. I don't know exactly what happened, but it was horrible for us. I saw other people get murdered too. I was worried all the time. That is one of many reasons life in Guatemala was so difficult. I never imagined how bad the journey would be. I heard that people died, the violence in Mexico and the cartels, but I always had the mindset that nothing would happen to me because I'm a good person. But the journey was very difficult for me. It's something that I don't want to remember. One night we crossed the Rio Bravo River and we were walking when immigration caught us. I was a minor, but they didn't know. And when they questioned me, they didn't ask me how old I was. They took me to a jail in San Antonio. There was no light, no fresh air to breathe. You don't know what will happen to you. You feel crazy. Finally, they took me to a doctor to check my teeth to see if I was an adult or underage. They realized then that I was a minor. Then they took me to a shelter for children. They treated me very well. My uncle came to get me. When I left the shelter in Corpus Christi, they gave me papers with a list of lawyers. And thank God I found the number for KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. I have permission to live here for now, but nothing more. I don't know what will happen in the future. The violence, the gangs that don't have a name. You don't know what they're capable of. This is my mom. I miss her very much. But I remember how life was in Guatemala, and it's gotten worse.
So what's behind the influx of child migrants and how is the US dealing with it? To discuss this, we're joined by Cesar's attorney, Jean Cohn-Connor. Also joining us, Jennifer Podkill, Program Officer for the Migrants' Rights and Justice Program at the Women's Refugee Commission. Jennifer, is it clear why there has been this spike over the last few years?
The spike started last spring, and we went down to the border and interviewed children who had been apprehended by Customs and Border Protection and spoke to them about why they were coming. And a lot of them were citing reasons of escaping violence in their home country, violence from gangs, violence from narco-traffickers, from drug cartels, and that a lot of the reasons for migration were a little different than they had been in the past, not coming here just to look for jobs or to reunite with family, but really out of fear for their safety and their well-being in their home country, and they were feeling pushed out of their home country, and that was the reason why they said a lot of them are coming to the
As
US.
we look at the timing, I mean, are there connections? I mean, we certainly on this show, we've often talked about how the war on drugs in Mexico has very much pushed the violence down into Central America. But I mean, is that what we think is one of the reasons then, that the violence and militarization has been pushed down there, and that's affecting children disproportionately then?
There's no question that Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador are getting much more dangerous. The homicide rates are very high. Gangs are often acting with impunity in a lot of parts of those countries, and they often have more power than any sort of law enforcement or any other organized government organizations in those countries. And they oftentimes target young people. So just by virtue of being young, regardless of the home life or what if the child has studied or not, they're being targeted and harassed, and girls are being raped and killed by these gangs. So these children are feeling like they need to leave because there's no one there to protect them.
What sort of age range are we talking about of those who are traveling up to the US?
Well, we've seen infants, very young children who are being brought up, and children up to 17. I would say the majority of the children who are coming are between 14 and 17, but as time goes on, younger and younger are children are migrating alone.
Jean, it was notable there that Cesar didn't really want to talk about the actual journey he had to take. But I mean, how harrowing is that journey once a minor decides to make it?
The trip was very harrowing. In his case, I know he had to travel by vehicle, and at the end of his trip, he was swimming across the Rio Grande. And some of the children actually have been known to drown from that. Others are assaulted along the way. So there's no doubt was a harrowing trip for him and for many of the others.
And Jennifer, I mean, in the Women's Refugee Center report on this phenomenon, I mean, in many cases, they're just on top of trains for much of the way. Is that correct? Some
children have no resources. They're not able to pay a smuggler to bring them up. So sometimes they'll just ride the train on top. And many children we spoke to said, look, I know how dangerous it is to cross through Mexico, but I know I will die if I stay here, and I only may die if I travel through Mexico, so I had to give it a shot.
So what happens then, Jennifer, or rather Jean, when they are caught, if and when they're caught by US authorities? I mean, the first 72 hours seems a particularly harsh time. It
is a very difficult time for them, and the authorities pick them up, and they are then brought by the Office of Resettlement into their facilities and interviewed.
But then, I mean, before that, though, Jennifer, they have to go through the process of interaction with Border Patrol, and it would seem from your report again that this might be even part of a wider problem with the conduct of Border Patrol on as they defend the border. But we heard that from Cesar. I mean, they didn't even ask if he was a minor, for example, there.
Many of the children that we spoke with spoke of extremely harsh treatment by Customs and Border Protection, told us that they were not appropriately screened either for their age or if they're coming here fleeing persecution or seeking some safety in the United States. And we're hoping that Customs and Border Protection is going to start looking at these children, because this number has not been going down. These high numbers are still coming of children, that they are going to be treated as vulnerable migrants who need protection, not as some threat, and not people who need to be mistreated when they come seeking safety in the United States.
But as things stand, is the training there, are the facilities there to handle this influx that has occurred over the last year and a half or 2 years?
At first, it was definitely an emergency situation. There was a backlog, so children were staying up to 2 weeks in border protection facilities where the lights are on 24 hours a day, and they weren't given adequate blankets or a change of clothes or being able to bathe, and they were languishing there for a long time and reporting a great deal of mistreatment. The government is responding to this and has been able to move the children out of these facilities faster. We would like to see facilities be a little more child-friendly and have more policies policies implemented to ensure that these children are being protected when they get here.
So, Jean, I mean, so this is where you come in some ways, though. I mean, you now, I mean, what's your goal then as you take on one of these minors' cases?
We actually come in at the point that the child has already been reunited with some sponsor, either a relative or a family friend, and they have actually moved out of the detention facility.
How easy was that process then? I mean, I suppose we shouldn't really gloss over that. I mean, how easy is it for relatives to come forward, particularly if they themselves are undocumented? What's the process by which, and the resources that are being put in to try and find someone, actually, perhaps, in the US, you might be able to...
Well, most of the children do come with some knowledge as to what adults there are already in this country who would be available to speak for them, and so that they do have that information. And then they travel to where the sponsors live. And so the children that we have been representing have traveled to the Maryland, Virginia, or DC region, and then go through the kind offices where we're then appointed as their pro bono counsel.
So what are you trying to prove? What sort of status can they apply for, actually, from that?
In terms of the status that they can apply for special immigrant juvenile status, and that is a mechanism to allow these unaccompanied minor children to ultimately receive legal permanent residence status in our country. And there are other vehicles as well. There is a T visa that is for trafficking victims. A very small subset of the children would fall within that. There's U visa, and that would be available to people who are victims of fairly serious crimes and then cooperate with the police. And there's a vehicle as well for them to obtain legal
So do you need to prove, though, I mean, how do you prove that such dangers exist?
There are legal requirements in each instance. The majority of the cases, though, that we at Kirkland have been handling fall within the special immigrant juvenile status category. And these are for children who are unmarried, they've either been abandoned or abused by their parents, and they cannot return to their country of origin. And then we file the paperwork, and you begin in family court, and then you move into immigration court.
So I mean, are the legal protections then sufficient then to help these cases?
Absolutely. The legal protections are sufficient for a large number of these children, but of course perhaps not for all. But the cases that we've handled generally do fall within that category.
But a key part of this process, I suppose, though, Jennifer, is having a lawyer to represent you. And there is no requirement for children to have a lawyer.
No, nobody in immigration court is given an attorney at the expense of the government. So you are allowed to find your own attorney, but you're not going to be given to one. Even if you're an unaccompanied child who doesn't speak the language and has never been to this country before, you're not even given any legal counsel.
I mean, at the very least, are there international treaties, perhaps, and requirements, though, which would make that
none that specifically require that the government pay for an immigration attorney. The hope is that the U.S. will recognize that these vulnerable migrants are a special subset and need legal representation in order for the courts to decide whether it is important for them to stay here in this country.
So if a child doesn't have a lawyer, and they're presented to a judge, perhaps not even speaking, I mean, they don't speak English.
Right, there are oftentimes interpreters in court, but it's very difficult for the judge and for the government attorney, for the immigration attorney who works for the government, to deal with these cases if a child is not represented, because they don't want to mistakenly deport somebody who has some ability to stay here, but it's hard for them to get all the information. And you can imagine how intimidated a child would be standing alone in court in front of a judge.
How are these cases viewed in general by the bench and judges and other officials, actually, in the process?
I think it depends. I think some people think a lot of these kids are just coming here to work or reunite with family, not understanding the severity of their situation in their home country and that they're fleeing persecution. Many courts around the country, the immigration courts, are getting better about having special dockets just for children and taking time to have the judge explain to them what it is like, but it's still very difficult for everybody if the child is not represented.
And do you feel, I mean, clearly it's best to to treat these cases as swiftly as possible, if possible reunite them with guardians or family members. Is the right balance being struck, though, between that and ensuring enough care is being taken, not just during the process, but even after the process actually is completed, that they are being cared for?
We would like to see the government do a little bit more follow-up when the children are released from the custody of the government and have been reunited, just to ensure that they are in a safe place and that they are able to get the legal counsel and the social services that they need to adjust to a new life here.
And even beyond that, what about oversight as to their treatment during their detention? We were talking about Border Patrol, and in your report again, I mean, they're terrible stories of just needless abuse and racism and violence.
Yes, so many of the children reported mistreatment, and there's no effective mechanism for them to report any of this abuse. They often don't even know where in the United States they are or what officer they're dealing with. But the only way right now to file a report against Customs and Border Protection officers is to go online in English and file a report. And these children, while they're detained, don't have access to the internet, and most of them do not speak English.
So, I mean, in conclusion then, Jean, I mean, what do you think needs to be done then to improve the system as it stands, to handle what Jennifer's report suggests is going to be how things are going to be, frankly, from now on? This is the new normal.
Well, I do think that the legal process could be streamlined. That would be one thing that would be very helpful. Right now, it takes a fair amount of time. You've got to go first into family court, and then you need to go through to immigration court. Secondly, it may be possible that there would be a way to provide for paralegal assistance, perhaps, so that you could get a broader base of children covered, so these children, some of the children are not appearing in court alone, especially
because this all takes money, I suppose, and that's the problem.
It's a matter of resources, no doubt about that.
Jennifer, are you seeing, I mean, as the surge, as the surge is witnessed and experienced, I mean, are you seeing attitudes change in Washington and elsewhere about?
I think the government is responding, recognizing this is going to be a long-term trend and not just a short-term emergency. Like you said, the issue is money, but there are a lot of policies and things that can be done that don't cost any money, that in a way that the U.S. government could be treating these vulnerable migrants better.
Jennifer Podcool, thank you very much. Jean Cohen-Connet, thank you too.
Thank you.
Now, in June, President Obama announced new guidance for those who are enforcing the U.S.'s immigration laws. Officials were encouraged to use prosecutorial discretion when considering the deportation of those who had been brought to the country before the age of 16. As long as they met educational requirements and had not broken the law, officials could consider deferring any deportation proceedings against them for 2 years. So, how successful has this initiative been? To discuss this, I'm joined from Los Angeles by Jonathan Perez. He's an undocumented migrant. He's project manager at the Immigrant Youth Coalition in Southern California. And in the studio, Marshall Fitz, Director of Immigration Policy at the Center for American Progress. Marshall, first of all, then, as far as you can see, how effective has this program been?
Well, I think they've done a remarkable job up to this point. We've got a program that was announced, as you said, on June 15th. It was up and running by August 15th. That's 2 months. And then in the 3 months that we've got numbers for, over a third of the undocumented population that would be eligible for this. There's approximately 950,000 people we think are currently eligible for deferred action under this program, and more than a third of them have already applied. Something like 55 or 60,000 now at this point have been granted deferred action. So in a short amount of time—
How many have not been granted deferred action?
Only a couple dozen cases have been formally denied. Some are continuing in the process of providing more information. Some were rejected as insufficient just because they didn't have the fee or anything, things of a basic nature. But only, I think, 2 dozen or 3 dozen at this point have actually been formally denied. So 55,000 approved, a few dozen denied.
About 150,000 still in the process.
In the process, and those numbers are as of November 15th. They're, I think, releasing. 250,000. They're releasing them every month on the 15th. So we should have some new numbers coming up on December 15th, and I'm hopeful. There was a lot of skepticism, justifiable, because this is a government agency that has not been terribly adept in the past, and it's, I think, done a pretty remarkable job up to this point.
Jonathan Perez, when we spoke just after Barack Obama announced this, you were pretty skeptical. What's your impression now?
Well, I think now, yeah, it is a better process. You know, we were skeptical because initially they had announced that Immigration Customs Enforcement was going to be the ones deciding, so they turned it over to USCIS. And so I think now we have to look at what is the larger context, what are the larger implications of what the Deferred Action Program has done. And I think now, if we look at all these thousands of people that are getting pulled out of the pool of deportable people, we still have to realize that Obama's administration still has a 400,000 a year goal of deportations. And when you pull out a significant part of the population, then the enforcement is greater on the rest.
I mean, that's
so
really,
the non-youth.
And we do need to get onto that, but very quickly, it's not a bad idea just to explain what was announced, because I mean, it was pretty misreported at the time as an executive order, effectively to halt the deportation of people under the age, who were brought here under the age of 16. But it certainly wasn't that. There were a lot of questions, and a lot hinged on this prosecutorial discretion now at the Customs and Immigration Service. But I mean, Marshall, it's not an automatic process. There are no guarantees if you come forward that you will have that deferral. And once you get that deferral, there are no guarantees that you will get a work permit as well. So there are all these kind of grey areas, though, aren't there, if you do come forward? And there's no real certainty what will happen to you after 2 years as well. So I mean, what about these questions?
I think the real question was what would happen after the 2 years.
Right.
I think because the president was reelected, there's no question but that they will renew the temporary stays of removal. But in terms of getting employment authorization, it's almost automatic. I mean, that's part of the application process. If you meet the basic criteria, it is pretty much automatic. Right. They're going to give you a grant.
I mean, in the past, I suppose the point was the prosecutorial discretion wasn't being used. There have been initiatives before saying, prioritize those with a criminal record. Right. It didn't happen.
Right, and that's why they had to do this, is because as Jonathan said, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which was responsible for managing the prosecutorial discretion initiative that preceded this, didn't do a very effective job, and there was a lot of frustration, and so the president stepped in, the secretary stepped in and said, USCIS, which is the services and benefits arm of the agency, you guys are going to administer this, and you're going to administer it basically like we administer other applications for benefits.
Jonathan, then, I mean, so you're saying there is this knock-on effect. As young people then are granted prosecutorial discretion, adults then are going to find it more difficult to have their cases heard because, frankly, President Obama is very proud of his quotas of people being deported.
Right, and I think, and also if you look at youth, part of the requirements is that you don't have more than 3 misdemeanors, and so it's still hard for a lot of youth, that grow up in low-income communities where the institutional conditions are not, the best, and so are forced into, committing crimes, and so.
But what do you mean by crime, though? What do you mean by a misdemeanor?
A crime can be a jaywalking or
driver's
riding
license,
your bicycle without a light. Driver's licenses, the work permits with deferred action they don't guarantee driver's licenses, only in certain states, and so that's another issue that we're very cautious of because the criminality is still there, that they can still be denied. It is restrictive, and beyond that, I think that if you look at places like California, where the prison industry is enormous, the largest in the world, and coincidentally also has the largest undocumented population, the conditions are not there for everyone to be able to take advantage of the deferred action. And then again, the enforcement piece of it, as immigration and local law enforcement are in close collaboration.
I mean, there was that sort of strangeness of the logic, Marshall, that actually only those who are high school educated should be eligible, if they had been brought to the country under the age of 16. I mean, so that's suggesting that if you were brought to the country under the age of 16 and you hadn't managed to get an education, then you are to blame and you should be deported. I mean, the underlying logic of all of this immigration law tends to be pretty bizarre, actually.
Yeah, it's obviously complicated. It's imperfect, and it's a non-solution to a bigger problem. I think that's what Jonathan's getting at. Is this isn't going to solve the problem. This is just an effort to provide some relief to a community that has organized itself effectively and
there's too much money there, I suppose, is the point, in criminalizing undocumented migrants to actually go for a rational system. I mean, I suppose that's what perhaps Jonathan's getting at.
Well,
yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
And at the same time, you know, we do have to really challenge that criminality when, you know, people are talking about comprehensive immigration reform again, but what we saw in the previous comprehensive immigration reform bills, it still had a lot of criminalization, enforcement, militarization of the border, and so these things are counter to what we're trying to do. We don't think that deportations are humane, and by justifying that you can deport a criminal or someone that's not a youth or someone that's not educated, then, you know, it just gets us in this, it's a slippery slope. It's defined by the law enforcement agencies, it's defined by society, and, you know, and it's not defined by the immigrants or, you know, the humanitarian organizations that are actually involved and actually see.
All right, well, we are going to have to leave it there, but we'll follow up in the new year. Jonathan Perez, thank you so much. Marshall Fitz, thank you too.
Thank you.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.